be up there. Can do, and I will be actually up at Michigan State doing an outreach called World Religions. Don't be fooled on April 1st. Do all religions lead to God? No. And we'll be talking about that on April 1st. April 3rd, he'll be teaching on worldview, a worldview seminar, and the worldviews that those religions are rooted in. So I have my doctoral degree in intercultural studies. I have very much an interest in cross-cultural ministry, how to contextualize the gospel for different religions and worldviews. And so Ken and I are going to work together on the Michigan State campus, April 1st, April 3rd. So Ken, we're very appreciative of you working with Dr. Behe as you have out at the University of Arizona, and look forward to your third book. If you'd be kind enough to host this meeting from here on and introduce Dr. Behe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Leo Lawson. Welcome, gentlemen and ladies. We're delighted to be here. We just flew in from Florida to California, so I'm trying to be jet lagged just a bit, but it's a pleasure to have you guys with us. We're going to get right into our guest speaker today, Dr. Michael Behe. We're very honored to have Dr. Behe on us here at the ACEA Zoomcast. And let me just give you a little background of Dr. Behe. He really doesn't need much of an introduction. If you're into apologetics and special creation, you've heard of him and know of him. But Dr. Michael Behe is a distinguished biochemist who earned his PhD from the University of Penn. He now lectures in biochemistry at Lehigh University, I think in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. So that's a beautiful part of the country. He is a distinguished senior fellow at the Discovery Institute for Science and Culture. In fact, that's where I met Dr. Behe about 5 years ago out in Seattle, with he and Stephen Meyer and Jonathan Wells and a lot of the other people there. And I was so impressed with not just the subject matter, but the character of these men. They're really men of God, men of high character, high stature. So they were very impressive. And so Dr. Behe is an amazing guy, and I had the opportunity to lecture with him at a conference out in Arizona about 5 years ago now, Michael. And it was just a pleasure getting to meet him. And so he's written several books. I can't read all of them off because, well, he'd be eating up his time. He has written Darwin's Black Box. Many of you have heard of that and read it. The Edge of Evolution, Darwin Evolves, A Mousetrap for Darwin, Science and Evidence for Design in the Universe. Michael, when do you sleep? That's my question I have for you with all these things. And so we are very honored and very, very blessed to have you with us, Dr. Michael Behe. He's going to be talking about the biochemical challenges for evolution. So Dr. Behe, take it away. God bless you.
Thanks very much, Ken. It's wonderful to be with everybody here. Let me start by sharing my PowerPoint stuff. I'm going to speak mostly from slides during the talk. So let me just get it set up here. Let me move that over a little bit and move this up to here. Okay. I'm going to start out just by talking in general about the argument for intelligent design in biology, because it's my experience that people don't really have a kind of clear view of what the actual logical structure of the argument is, and can oftentimes be sidetracked and be frustrated in discussions about evolution and design because of that. So I'm going to give a basic argument just so people know the form of it, and then if time permits, we can get into some more recent stuff that I've written about. But here, let me just see if I can advance that. Okay, so my argument is going to have 5 points, 5 general points. And the first one is that the conclusion of design for something is not some mystical decision. It's not something you have to be, concentrating on or attuned to. It's just deduced from the physical structure of a system, just ordinary looking at stuff. And that in biology, when people observe the stuff in biology, the various systems in biology, everyone agrees that those structures appear to be designed. But of course, as we know, at least in the past 150 some odd years, uh, some folks think that they have an explanation that does not involve real design. They think it's just an apparent design. And they think that Darwinian processes can account for the appearance of design in biology. So my third point is to say that there are structural obstacles to Darwinian evolution. There are physical reasons to think that it cannot do what its proponents claim for it. And the fourth point is going to address the fact that whenever you turn on a TV program on science or open a newspaper where life is being discussed, you're told that scientists already know that we have an explanation for how life came to be, that they already know that Darwinian processes can explain what has been discovered in life. So the fourth point I want to make is that those claims that we already know, we've already got an explanation, rest on undisciplined imagination. Now, imagination is important in science as it is in many other disciplines, but when it is undisciplined, then it can be a two-edged sword. It can get you in trouble. And the fifth point will be a summary point. And it's going to say that right now, in the year 2025, we have strong evidence in hand for design and just bluster and little evidence for Darwinism. So that's going to be the general structure of the talk, and I'm going to go through each of these points in turn, beginning with the first one, that design is not some mystical conclusion. It's deduced from the ordinary physical structure of a system. So let's begin with a kind of a philosophical question. We have minds. We know we have minds from introspection, but how do we know anybody else has a mind? Or how do we know that some mind has done something or caused something to happen? And the main guy who thought about this, or thought about it most productively, is this fellow named Thomas Reid, who was a philosopher in the school of what's called common sense, a Scottish philosopher in the 18th century. And he said, well, we can't read minds, so we can only infer minds and intelligence from the effects that the minds have. So he wrote that intelligence in the cause can be inferred from its marks or signs in the effect. Well, okay, that's fine. What are those marks? What sorts of marks do we look for? Well, if you look in the dictionary, if you ask yourself, what is design, or what is purposeful, intelligent design? If you look in just the dictionary and ask yourself, what's the pertinent sense of design here? You can find something like this, that design is the purposeful or inventive arrangements of parts or details. And we can simplify that. So design, we'll say, is the purposeful arrangement of parts. And since we ourselves have minds, we can comprehend purposes. And so we infer design whenever we see that parts have been arranged for a purpose. Okay, that's kind of just a bunch of words, and it's oftentimes better to see examples of this. So here's an example on the next slide of what I mean. Okay, this is one of my favorite cartoons. This is from a strip called The Far Side. I don't know if anybody here has ever seen it. It's been out of print now for a while. But in this, we've got a troop of jungle explorers here. And the lead explorer has been strung up and skewered. And this fellow here turns to this guy here and says, "That's why I never walk in front." I always thought that was good advice, but I never took it. Okay, so the point is this. Everybody looking at this cartoon immediately realizes that this was designed. This was not an accident. His death was intended. As a matter of fact, the humor of the cartoon depends on you recognizing that this was purposely arranged, that this was designed. If he had just fallen off a cliff or something, well, it wouldn't have been all that funny. But how do you know that? How do you know that this thing here was designed? I mean, it's made out of natural components, vine, some bamboo sticks, and so on. Well, you know it's designed because you see a number of things arranged for a purpose, for the purpose of being a trap. So design is the purposeful arrangement of parts. And it turns out, since we are incarnate beings, since we interact with matter, and that's the way we understand intelligence, a purposeful arrangement of parts is the way, the only way that we recognize the work of a mind. Now, the arrangement of parts can be anything. I mean, it could be words in a sentence, of course. It could be parts in a machine. It could be proportions of a figure. But it's the purpose that we apprehend in physical parts is the way that we recognize the work of a mind. Okay, there's one more point, though, that is necessary to remember, or otherwise you can get confused. And that is because we apprehend purpose from physical arrangements, the strength of our inference, the strength of our conviction that we're seeing something that was purposely arranged, that was designed, is quantitative. And by that, I just mean that the more parts we have, and the more closely they fit the purpose of the arrangement, the more and more and more confident we can be in the conclusion of design. And here, let me just show you an illustration of what I mean with that too. Okay, here's a picture of some mountains called the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho. And if you and a friend were walking by there, you'd admire them for their beauty. But if somebody asked you how they got to be there, well, you might say, oh, I don't know, plate tectonics or volcanic activity or something. And that seems pretty natural. Everybody would be satisfied with that. But suppose you and your friend were walking by this mountain here, this guy here, called Old Man of the Mountain, New Hampshire. And you looked at it and you said, holy moly, this looks like a forehead, and maybe this looks like a nose and a chin down here, maybe a mouth. So it's called Old Man of the Mountain because it kind of looks like a face. And unfortunately, it fell down because it was unstable. These are workers from the Forestry Service in New Hampshire trying to stabilize it, but they weren't able to. But suppose somebody said, how do you think that got there? And suggested, say, well, do you think some prehistoric tribe, wanted to honor somebody? Or you'd say, nah, probably not. It's interesting, but it's just kind of a loose arrangement of rocks. If you look at it from a different direction, it doesn't really look like a face, and so it's interesting, but not definitive. But suppose you and your friend continued your walk and you came to these mountains in South Dakota. Now, if he asked you where do you think they came from, you would never say plate tectonics. or erosion or any, undirected natural process. And the reason is that the parts of the system so closely fit its purpose, the purpose to portray the presidents of the United States, that you are overwhelmingly confident that this was purposefully designed. So the point is that we can have more and more evidence of design, and as the number of pieces and their arrangement increases, we can be morally certain that something was purposefully designed. Okay, so that's the general point, that we deduce the conclusion of design from the physical structure of a system, because we have minds and we can perceive purposes. When we see a purpose served by the system, we conclude that it was designed. But of course, some, I'm sorry, let me just say, and this conclusion that biology, that life, that aspects of it overwhelmingly look to be designed, has elicited agreement throughout history. Everyone agrees that aspects of biology appear to be designed, and that has gone through all cultures and all ages. For example, way back 3,000 or so years ago, King David wrote, "I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." Now, did you ever ask yourself the question, how did David know that he was fearfully and wonderfully made? Was it because somebody told him? Was it because of a revelation that you're fearfully and wonderfully made, that you're not just a blob of something or other? No, he could see it. He was familiar with his body and say, wow, look, I got these fingers. They're great. They're arranged so that I can grasp things. I got muscles. I can throw a spear. I've got my fingers let me play the harp. I've got eyeballs that can see in the distance. He knew it. He saw firsthand that the parts of his body were purposefully arranged, and that justified a conclusion of design. Now, the ancient Hebrews were many things, but they did not have much of a systematic science. Science developed only very, very slowly over the years as humans developed and got more time to investigate nature and so on. But as science advanced, the conclusion of design only got more and more firm, more and more intense. For example, about 1,000 or so years after King David, this guy named Galen lived during the classical ages of Greece and Rome, and he was a Greek physician who actually lived in Rome, and he was one of the first scientists who did dissections and studied anatomy in very great detail. Arguably, he was one of the most prominent scientists of the classical age. And from his studies, he wrote that the human body is the result of a supremely intelligent and powerful divine craftsman. That is, it's the result of intelligent design. Notice that David, of course, was Jewish. Galen was a pagan. He was followed the Roman pantheon. Nonetheless, from their observation of living systems, they both could tell with certainty that the systems were purposely designed. As science advanced, this got even more obvious. For example, in the Middle Ages, the 1600s or so, this guy here, this handsome fellow named Anton von Leeuwenhoek, was an early microscopist. And he was one of the first to see single-celled creatures, amoeba, bacteria, and so on, in various media. And he wrote that, from what he saw, from the physical arrangements, the various structures that these bugs used to help them live, he could see the incomprehensible perfection, the exact order, the inscrutable providential care that God had placed in he called these animalcules, which are tiny animals. So again, the point is that he made this conclusion from his observations, not from prior philosophical or religious assumptions. And the argument for design from the structure of life perhaps reached its zenith with this fellow here. This is William Paley, who was an English Anglican clergyman back in the early 1800s. And he famously wrote the watchmaker argument, saying that if you found a watch in a field and you opened it up and saw how all of the parts interacted with each other in order to keep time, you would immediately know that it was designed. And you would know so because they are so formed and adjusted to produce motion. They were made for their purpose. And the inference is inevitable. The watch must have had a maker. And he went on in his book to argue that systems in life, living systems, and even in the broader universe, are even more elegantly arranged than in a watch. And so we have even more reason to conclude that life was designed. Now, of course, after Paley, in the 1800s, Charles Darwin proposed his theory of evolution, and we'll get to that in a minute. But right now, I want to emphasize that his proposal of that did not change at all the fact that everybody who looks at life says, wow, that looks purposeful, that looks designed. And the more and more we know, the more and more obvious that becomes. And as an example, let's look at what Richard Dawkins himself wrote. Richard Dawkins, as you know, is the foremost apologist, shall we say, for Darwin in our age. He thinks that Darwin's theory is correct and can explain life, but in arguably his most emphatic defense of Darwin, The Blind Watchmaker, back in 1986, he wrote in the very first chapter, on the very first page, that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. That's the very definition of biology, according to Richard Dawkins. The appearance, the study of things that give the strong appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Well, okay, why does he think that they were designed for a purpose? Is it because, flowers look so pretty and baby seals look so cute? Is it because of, say, aesthetic reasons that Richard Dawkins and other Darwinians think that life appears designed? Well, no. It turns out that Dawkins thinks life has the appearance of design not because of aesthetic reasons, but because of engineering reasons. As he writes a little bit further, he says, we may say that a living body or organ is well designed if it has attributes that an intelligent and knowledgeable engineer might have built into it in order to achieve some sensible purpose. So pretty much here, he's saying that we recognize design, or we think that something has been designed when we see a purposeful arrangement of parts. So even Richard Dawkins agrees that that is how we recognize design. That's what gives us the inference of design. And he says that we can see it. We can just see it. An engineer can recognize an object that has been designed, even poorly designed, just by looking at the structure of the object. So one more time, we recognize design by the purposeful arrangement of parts. Everybody agrees to that. Oh yes, one other point, we can ask, well, does Dawkins think that the appearance of design is something like seeing faces in clouds, or is it something like the old man of the mountain? Well, no, he goes on to say that the appearance of design in life is overwhelming. He attributes it to natural selection, but he says this appearance is really extremely powerful. Okay, so everyone, including modern day evolutionary biologists, even ones who are strong atheists, such as Richard Dawkins, everyone agrees that aspects of biology appear to be designed. But of course, Richard Dawkins does not think that life was purposely designed. He thinks that Darwin's theory can account for that appearance. So the next point that we're going to look at is to show that there are structural obstacles to Darwinian evolution, that there are physical reasons to think that it can't do what its boosters claim for it. And first of all, we have to ask ourselves, well, what is Darwin's theory? And you've got to remember that Charles Darwin, was born over 200 years ago. He was a man of the 19th century. And the 19th century was a time of great explorations. Here's a British sailing ship. And Darwin, as you know, took a round the world voyage from England all the way down around South America and then over to Australia and Asia and back to Africa and then back to England. So this was a time in history when Europeans were exploring regions of the world they've never seen before. And Darwin, as the naturalist on the ship, tried to find plants and animals that he hadn't seen before in Europe. And he saw a number of things that he hadn't seen before. And one thing he saw was a bunch of finches on an island chain called the Galapagos, which is a few hundred miles west of Ecuador, the country of Ecuador. And he saw that there were a number of different species on a number of the islands of the chain. And he thought, how could each island have its own species of finch? There weren't that many finch species on the mainland of South America. And by thinking about this and related sorts of biological problems, he came up with what's called his theory of evolution by natural selection. And in a nutshell, he saw that individuals of a species can vary. Some members of a species might be bigger than others. Some might be a little bit faster. Some might have a little bit more brightly colored plumage or something. And Darwin thought, well, hey, maybe there are some circumstances in which one of those variations might favor the survival of the variant. And if that were the case, then that organism would have more opportunities to mate and leave more offspring. And if the traits are inherited somehow, Darwin didn't know how that might be, but if they were, then more of the next generation would have what maybe just one of the species had in the first generation. And then in the next generation, even more would have that. And the third generation, even more, until it became the norm for the whole species. And then maybe another variation would come along that was helpful and would spread through the species. It was a good idea, but what we should do is we have to, if we're going to analyze this, without getting confused, we should recognize that what's called Darwin's theory, and singular, actually has a number of parts, a number of logically separable ideas that are squished together and called his theory. But we can tease those apart, and some of them might be right, others might be wrong. We would have to evaluate them individually. And for our purposes here, we can distinguish three different ideas in his theory. The first is the idea of common descent. That is, that organisms today, maybe different kinds of organisms today, have the same kind of a trait. And the idea of common descent is maybe they both descended from a common ancestor. And that's why they have the trait today, because they inherited it from the common ancestor. And in my evaluation, the idea of common descent is interesting, but it's trivial. It might be an interesting fact about natural history, but it doesn't say where the common ancestor came from. It just posits a common ancestor. It doesn't say where the trait came from that descendant species inherit. It just postulates it was there. And it doesn't say how descendant species came to change. It just says, well, that's unexplained right now. They just inherited it from a common ancestor. Well, okay, that's interesting, but it doesn't really try to explain anything. The next component of his theory is the idea of natural selection. And as you know, the idea of natural selection is maybe those traits, one of those traits helps the organism survive. And if it does, well, then it has a chance to leave more offspring in the next generation. Well, again, that's an interesting idea. Yeah, you can say statistically, well, maybe that feature gives you a better chance to survive. But again, it's trivial, because you're saying if an organism has a better feature, it's going to do better in the world. Well, duh, So that's interesting too, but ultimately kind of trivial. 99% of the scientific weight of Darwin's theory, and not only scientific, but philosophical weight, maybe even theological weight, is all concentrated in the idea of random mutation. The critical claim of Darwinism is that the random changes can provide the fodder for natural selection to build the most intricate structures that have been discovered in biology. And that is the claim of Darwin's theory, that the intelligent design theory concentrates on. We don't necessarily talk about these guys. The question is random mutation sufficient to power Darwin's theory? And again, I say that is overwhelmingly important part of the theory. And other folks agree too, including folks who see that it not only has scientific, but it has philosophical implications too. For example, this guy here is named Douglas Fatuma, who's an evolutionary biologist at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. And 20 years or so ago, he was given an interview. He wrote that the reason that natural selection, and by natural selection, he folds in the idea of random mutation, which a lot of folks do. So that can be another confusing point. When they talk about natural selection, they mean natural selection acting on random variation, not guided variation, not programmed variation, but random variation. The reason it's important is that it's the central idea that explains design in nature. Before Darwin, The adaptations and exquisite complexity of organisms were ascribed to creation by an omnipotent, beneficent designer, namely God. So this is where the rubber meets the road, the idea of random mutation. Well, okay, so can Darwin's theory explain what we see in life? Well, you have to remember again that Darwin was a man of the 19th century, and that the science of the 19th century, especially the biology of the 19th century, biological knowledge, was primitive compared to what we know today. And to drive home that point, here's a drawing of something that was dubbed Bathybius heckelii. This was the age of exploring ships, and some ships dredged up some mud from the sea bottom. And this mud right here was looked at by a man named Ernst Haeckel and another man named Thomas Huxley, who were friends and boosters of Darwin. And they looked at it under their crude microscopes of the day, and they thought that this looked like a cell. So they concluded that maybe life could just bubble up from the seafloor. And if it could just bubble up from the seafloor, well, maybe it could change after that and become whatever we can see with our eyeballs today. But like I said, it turned out just to be mud. But this is the point, that in Darwin's day, nobody knew what cells were. They were mysterious things. Nobody even knew that molecules or atoms existed. They were still theoretical entities. But in the ensuing 150 some odd years, and especially in the last 75 years, biology has made astounding progress in its knowledge. In the early 1950s, Watson and Crick discovered the shape of DNA. Later on in the 50s, the shape of proteins, which are the machines which actually do the work of the cell. They started to be discovered. This is a guy named John Kendrew who was involved in discovering the shape of hemoglobin. The genetic code was discovered. Later on, various techniques were invented which allowed science to progress more rapidly. This represents cloning of DNA, something called the polymerase chain reaction, sequencing reactions too. So what has science, what has biology discovered in the past 75 years from our astounding progress? Well, I think arguably the most fundamental fact that biology has uncovered is that the cell is run by machines, literally machines made out of molecules. This is the cover of a journal called Cell, a professional biology journal. And it, as you see, has a special issue on macromolecular machines. And in the lower corner here, you see something that looks like William Paley's watch. If you turn the page and look at the table of contents, you see articles such as the cell as a collection of protein machines, polymerases and the replisome, machines within machines, mechanical devices of the spliceosome, motors, clocks, springs, and things. And this was in 1998, and it's only gotten much, much more intense as science has accelerated even more. For example, here's a paper that was published just a few years ago on the structure of a machine called ATP synthase. And ATP synthase pretty much makes all of the energy molecules in the bodies of almost all types of organisms on Earth. And you probably can't tell just from the cartoon diagram here, but it is pretty much like a turbine engine. Just like if you think of a dam, a hydroelectric dam, where water falling over the dam turns an engine and that generates electricity by its turning. This uses a flow of acid from outside the cell into the inside of the cell, which flows through this very intricate structure, and in so doing allows the cell to make a particular energy-filled molecule called ATP. Now, in the past, coming up on 30 years now, I have written these several books that all make, with different emphases, the argument that Darwin's mechanism, as we've just understood it, is grossly inadequate to explain the molecular structures of life. It can't account for pretty much anything. And that a firm conclusion of purposeful design is empirically justified. And by that, I mean it's justified based on the physical evidence, empirical evidence. And the evidence is the purposeful arrangement of the parts of the system. So let me quickly go through the argument that I gave in Darwin's Black Box. Several of you say you're familiar with it. Maybe some of the others aren't, but let me just recap it in the context of this overall argument that I'm making. And Darwin's Black Box kind of concentrated on a problem with Charles Darwin's idea that he himself recognized. In The Origin, he discussed the structure of eyes, vertebrate eyes, which even back then were known to be exquisitely purposeful structures. And he kind of flapped his hands around and kind of tried to explain them away. But at the end, he said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. But he added, but I can find out no such case. Darwin insisted on this very gradual mode of evolution, that in his view, evolution had to work very slowly over long periods of time in tiny, tiny steps, because he knew that if a bunch of things all together came together suddenly in one big event, then it would look terribly like it was not random. And the randomness was the point of Darwin's theory, because that would try to rule out an intelligent agent. Well, okay, he insisted on numerous successive slight modifications. Well, what sort of a system would not be able to be made by many small modifications, and each step being an improvement and maintaining the function of the system along the way? Well, it turns out that such a system is one that I termed irreducibly complex, or has the property of irreducible complexity. And that's a fancy phrase, but it just means that it's a system that needs a number of different components, all of which are working with each other in order to produce a function that the individual pieces themselves could not produce. Again, it's just a phrase, and it's, to understand it, it's good to look at an example of it. And an example of what I mean by that in our everyday world is just a little old mousetrap. Here's a mousetrap you might buy at a hardware store. And even that has a bunch of different pieces. It's got this wooden platform to which everything's attached, tightly wound spring that presses against the platform with this extension here and presses against what's called the hammer, this other metal piece. There's another piece called the holding bar, which holds it in place, and a number of other things too. Well, it turns out that all of these pieces are needed for the trap to work. If you take away the hammer, you take away the spring, It's not that you have a trap that works half as well as it used to or a quarter as well. It's broken. It doesn't work at all. So it turns out that if you wanted to make something like this by something like a Darwinian evolutionary process, it's a big problem because how would you start? Would you start with one of the pieces? No, that doesn't work. It doesn't catch mice. Even one of them with another one added, or even two or three added. You've got to have the whole schmear all together before it has its function. So there's nothing for natural selection to select until the system's pretty much complete, but then who needs it after it's complete? So natural selection doesn't really explain anything. Now, if you look at this, this is a machine. And if you look at the definition of machine in a dictionary, you see something like this, that a machine is a complex device consisting of a number of interrelated parts, each having a definite function, together together to perform a certain kind of work. So the definition of machine implies irreducible complexity. You got a bunch of different things, each of which is necessary to do its job. Well, the question is, are there any machines in living systems? And as we saw on that issue of Cell, this journal Cell, a couple slides ago, the big discovery of life is that the cell is filled with machines. It's run by machines. And here's one that has become sort of famous in the past couple decades, the bacterial flagellum. The flagellum is quite literally an outboard motor that bacteria use to swim. This long thread-like portion acts as the propeller. It's spun around and around and around, and therefore pushes against the water and pushes the bacterium forward. It's attached to the motor, which has a drive shaft, this yellow part here. And as it spins, it causes this to spin. But this is spinning in a different plane than this is. So there is something called the hook region, which acts as a universal joint, which switches the plane of rotation from here to here. And without that, the thing would be broken. The motor is composed of a number of different parts. There's the stator, the rod, the drive shaft, the rotor itself. There are bushing materials to allow it to poke through the membrane. So just like a mousetrap, if this is missing any of its parts, it doesn't work. So you can't build this gradually with just one thing and then another and then another. It's pretty much got to be complete before it works at all. So as I pointed out in Darwin's black box, these machines resist Darwin's theory for just the reason that he said in The Origin of Species, that they need numerous parts to be put together before they work. And it turns out that irreducible complexity then has twofold importance. The first, as we just discussed, it's an obstacle to Darwin's mechanism, because natural selection can't build multi-step systems. And it is evidence of purposeful design, because irreducibly complex systems are purposeful arrangements of parts. Just like a mousetrap, the parts are put together for a purpose. The same thing with a bacterial flagellum. Okay, so that was the point, that there are structural obstacles to Darwinian evolution. But if you ask people, or if you read the newspapers, magazines, nobody talks about that. They'll say that why science already knows that Darwin's theory can account for the structures of life. So just a few quotations here to show you that those claims rest on undisciplined imagination. And the first one is from a book written 20-ish or so years ago by a man named Franklin Harold, who's now deceased, but he was a very prominent microbiology at the University of Colorado State University. he wrote a book called The Way of the Cell, published by Oxford University Press, as you can imagine, a very prestigious academic publishing house. And he writes about a lot of things, but in the course of it, he starts to talk about intelligent design. My book had just been published about 5 years or so ago. And he writes about it for a short while and says the following. He says, we should reject, as a matter of principle, the substitution of intelligent design for the dialogue of chance and necessity, that is Darwinism. And he cites my book there. But we must concede that there are presently no detailed Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biochemical system, only a variety of wishful speculations. Well, okay, and so he makes 2 points here. Let's go through them kind of in reversed order. He says that there are no Darwinian accounts of the evolution of biochemical systems, only a variety of wishful speculations. You know, kind of like the just so stories that were written by Rudyard Kipling in the beginning of the 20th century, you know, how the tiger got its stripes, how the rhinoceros got its horn, how the bacterium got its flagellum. You know, that's the level at which the explanation in the scientific literature is stuck. We don't have accounts for that. We just have just so stories. So these things remain unexplained by Darwin's theory. Okay, the second point, he said, is that we should reject, as a matter of principle, intelligent design. Notice he's not saying as a matter of evidence. He's saying as a matter of principle, we should reject it. Well, okay, what principle is that? Well, it turns out he doesn't say, he doesn't write. He just writes this, which I show on the slide, and then goes on to talk about other things. But I know I can easily guess the principle that he had in mind, and that is shown on this next slide here. And it is this, that the idea of intelligent design seems to point strongly beyond nature. It seems to have philosophical, even theological implications, and that makes a lot of folks in the scientific community nervous. And so they want to avoid having to deal with that. And I just say that even from a scientific point of view, when I was being trained in my education, we were told that science is supposed to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Let other people worry about the philosophical consequences. That's what we were told when people thought Darwin's theory could account for everything. They said, well, science just follows the evidence. Now that science is unturning things uncongenial to Darwin and strongly indicative of intelligent design, we should continue to follow that evidence. So Franklin Harold's book was written, as I showed, in the early 2000s, but the situation has not changed at all. There are still zero explanations for any complex biological machine. As an example, here's a paper that was written just a couple years ago. The senior author is a guy named Eugene Koonin, who's a really smart bioinformatician. And they write here, toward a theory of evolution as multi-level learning. And this is just one of many kinds of papers that say Darwin's theory can't explain anything. Here's a new idea I have, and here's my brand new idea which will explain things. And in the introduction, they write, modern evolutionary theory has little to say about the actual history of life, especially the emergence of new levels of biological complexity, and nothing at all about the origin of life. So the point is, there's no explanation from Darwin's theory and people are just kind of floundering around trying to come up with something. None of these alternatives to Darwin's theory has caught on or looks like it has any chance of explaining what has been discovered at the foundation of life. So, but the point is, again, that the claims for Darwin's theory are just undisciplined imagination. And here's an image that I want to leave you with for Darwin's theory today. And it's this, that Darwin's theorem is a Potemkin village. And as you know, a Potemkin village is, a facade of something that looks really nice, but when you look behind it, there's either nothing there or decaying and rotten structures. And it's from history where some Russian official was supposed to have built some fake villages along the river for when the Russian empress took a river boat tour of some of her villages, and he wanted to impress her that things were looking better than they actually were. Darwin's theory puts up a nice front, but if you ask probing questions, you quickly realize that there's little to nothing behind it. So that was the point, that those grand Darwinian claims rest on undisciplined imagination. And so let's go to the concluding point. The concluding point is that right now we have in hand very strong evidence for design and little evidence for Darwinism right now in the year 2025. And you might be saying to yourself, well, okay, we just talked about the little evidence for Darwinism, but remind me again, what is the strong evidence for design? And again, the evidence for design is exactly what Richard Dawkins wrote in The Blind Watchmaker, that in life, the structures of life overwhelmingly impress us with the appearance of design as if by a master watchmaker. We conclude design. We know that a mind has arranged something when we see a purposeful arrangement of parts. And the more intricate and the more elegant, the greater the intelligence that we can conclude from the designer of the system. And as another example, just let me show you this one, that a few years ago, a study was published in Nature where some microscopists in England looked at a common insect called a plant hopper. But they had a fancy new microscope that was able to image some small structures and stages of the plant hopper that never had been done before. Turns out the plant hopper gets its name because it can hop higher and further than any other creature, at least on a size scale. And they noticed some bumps on the top of the legs of one of the stages of the plant hopper. And they said, what are those things? And they looked more closely with their fancy new microscope, and they saw that those bumps were gears, real, hard, solid, mechanical gears. And this article engendered several weeks worth of theological discussion on the internet and people going back and forth about it. But then it kind of died down and people forgot about it. But nonetheless, this is what biology has been discovering, an enormous trove of purposeful arrangement of parts at whatever levels it looks at. So it turns out that the argument for design says that whenever we see purposeful arrangements of parts, we've always found that they were produced by a mind, something with a mind. There was a mind behind the purposeful arrangement. Now that we have discovered these in biology, we are justified in concluding that those were produced by a mind as well. So what kind of reasoning is that? That you say that because we've seen something in all these circumstances, we're justified in concluding it for a similar circumstance. Well, you might know there are two general kinds of reasonings, deductive and inductive. And this is inductive reasoning. And if you look up inductive reasoning in a reference work like Encyclopedia Britannica, you see the definition that it's when a person uses a number of established facts to draw a general conclusion, that's inductive reasoning. This is the kind of logic normally used in the sciences. So I just want to emphasize that a conclusion of intelligent design in biology is a scientific conclusion. It is based on empirical evidence, the purposeful, or the structures of the machinery that has been found at the foundation of life.
So let's just wait a moment as Dr. Behe's um, computer uh, catches up and we get him connected back again. I know that Ken Du is online and Ken will be handling the questions when Dr. Behe's back online. And Ken,
Here I am. Was it me or was it something else?
Yeah, you're good to go. You're good to go now, Michael. Go ahead, carry on.
Okay, let me get my slides back on here, share them again.
And Ken, we do have some questions in the chat, so if you can give those first priority as you begin to draw Dr. Behe into the answers.
Yeah, I saw that. No problem. I'll do that. Go ahead, Dr. Behe.
Okay, well, that's pretty close to it. Let me just
You were
get a few.
Encyclopedia Britannica is where you were.
I'm sorry?
You were at the Encyclopedia Britannica?
Yeah, that's close to the end. Oh, there we go. Okay. Can you see that? There's the thinker there. Okay, let me go ahead. I'm going to go skip ahead a couple slides here. I'm not going to get to the extra component because I talked too long, but I want to share this right here. You might have heard that not everybody agrees with intelligent design. And so I've received a few criticisms over the years, and I've responded to them. There are a couple places, if you want to look up the criticisms. I have a few things on my own website at Lehigh University. Here, let me just grab a laser pointer here. And also at the Discovery Institute's website. They have a blog named Evolution News and Views. I have a lot of stuff there. And also there's a site that somebody set up for me because I don't know how to do it in my own name. And there's all of my articles and also some videos that people might find entertaining. Additionally, 5 years or so ago, I collected all of my responses to critics and put them together into this book, which is published by Discovery Institute Press. So if you're interested in the back and forth nitty gritty of all of the objections and responses, that's the place to go. So that's my presentation for now. So I'd like to stop and I'll be happy to take questions.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Michael. Good job, Dr. Behe. I know that that was just a passing glance of really the your lecture, and really appreciate that. We've got a few questions that we want to bring up for discussion, and a young man, Christopher, I think is on there. He had a couple of questions, and I think his first question I'll give to you. It says, how did David, when you gave the example of David realizing there was a God, how did David in scripture recognize his design and attribute it to Yahweh, or attribute it to the God of the Jewish people? That was his question.
Okay, well, that's a fine question. But I think that there are probably folks here who are better equipped to to answer the question than I. The only reason I use that quotation is to make the point that David did not need to be told that something was designed. It wasn't a revelation to him. Other things were revealed to him, but the fact that he was fearfully and wonderfully made, he could see himself, that he could see his muscles and his limbs and his eyesight and his senses and so on. Uh, so that the simple conclusion that it was designed can be perceived in the physical structure. Now, other conclusions, which the question implies, like who designed it? And that's a
Right.
great, now that has to be revealed, or, that is the province of philosophy or in history and theology and so on. And again, that's not my strength here. Lots of folks here would be better answering that question. But the simple the simple conclusion that something was produced by a mind somehow can be deduced from the structure of a system itself. You don't need uh, any other evidence to conclude that.
Excellent. Very good. Very good. And just to follow up on that, Christopher had another question. I just want to get that, and then we're going to go to Gabe Bouch. He has a very excellent question too. Christopher asked, are we assuming each part of the flagellum, when you're talking about irreducible complexity, was introduced as it is? Couldn't it have been the case that they existed in variations in one part that gave the system a similar function?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. That's one of the objections that I address in my book, Mousetrap for Darwin. There's a problem with that. That question is, maybe a part of it had been used for something else and this part used for something else. But if they're used for something else, then they've got to be adjusted for each other to work cooperatively in the flagellum. In Darwin's black box, I address this. I say, suppose you wanted to make a mouse trap and you went into your garage and you say, well, I'll take this board here. I'll take these wooden popsicle sticks and maybe I can use them for the wooden platform of the mousetrap. And I'll this old grandfather clock in my garage, that's got a spring in it too. Maybe I'll use that and other things that had been used for other purposes. You still have the problem of adjusting them for each other. You've still got the problem of adding the components, even if they're pre-adjusted. They've got to fit with each other, then fit with a third part and a fourth part, and it's not until they're completed that you've got the function.
Yeah.
So that doesn't get you out of it.
Yeah, isn't that the term called co-option, where you
Yes.
borrow from another mechanism and try to make it fit? It's like taking a carburetor from a 1974 Pontiac and trying to put it on a 2010 Pontiac. It doesn't work, even though it was made for the same function. The co-option thing is not compatible. Is that correct?
That is exactly correct. And when people use that, they usually just kind of breeze over any details that would that nature would have to attend to if that were actually possible.
Great. Yeah, good questions, Christopher. We're going to go now to Gabe Bouch. I think we got Gabe on there. Gabe, go ahead and ask the question yourself. You need to unmute first.
All right. Yeah, great. Thank you. I loved it, by the way. Thank you so much for taking your time to do this. When I was looking into irreducible complexity in the past, it seemed to me that no good pushbacks were coming up against it, except for I remember some kind of scaffolding argument that perhaps there's a path in which you do get slight improvement with each additional step. And then once you have some, and then at some point it sort of reverses and unnecessary pieces fall away. As I recall, it was very speculative, but is there any thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, what you find out is that Darwinists have great imaginations, and what they just don't have are great experiments. In that part that I didn't manage to get to, I was going to talk about experiments that have been done over the past couple decades, where some scientists, some microbiologists have grown bacteria in flasks in their labs for decades. A guy in particular named Richard Lenski has grown something called E. coli bacteria. What he does is grows it up in a little flask with nutrients in it, and it grows for a day. And then he takes and it fills the flask, and he takes a little bit of that and uses it to seed a new fresh flask, and it grows up in that for a day, and takes some of that and grows it up for another day. And these bacteria, because they reproduce so quickly, have gone through 70,000 generations in the past couple decades. And there have been trillions of these little cells produced. And he has seen that they do evolve in the sense that some variants will do better and take over the flasks. And it turns out, though, and there are new methods developed that can look at the mutations in the DNA with great precision, which wasn't possible 20 or so, 25 years or so ago. So it's only now that science is getting to be able to look at the mutations that allow these adaptations, allow these changes that they see in labs and around us. And it turns out that the first mutation that this fellow found helped the bacteria grow a lot faster and crowd out all the other ones was one where it took a gene to produce something called ribose and broke it and threw it away. And for some reason, still not known, that helped it grow about 5% faster than other organisms. And the next one he looked at a couple of years later was for a different gene. And when he found the mutation in that, it turns out it broke the gene. And the next one broke a different gene. And in the year 2016, he published a paper that showed the top 40 mutations that helped E. coli adjust and grow faster in the flask. All of them broke or degraded pre-existing genes. Nothing was building anything resembling the machinery we see in the cell. But if you ask a microbiologist, well, how about these problems? They'll say, well, and they'll close their eyes and say, suppose this happens, then this comes along. And they're guiding things in the pathway they want to go. And in that book, Mousetrap for Darwin, I have a couple of other examples too, where there were experiments done to check on whether pathways that had been suggested were viable. And in each case, it turns out that they were wrong. They were incorrect. So let me just point out that Darwin's Black Box was published in the year 1996, which is coming up on 30 years ago. And when it was published, lots of scientists hated it. They hated it with a passion. And there were a lot of real smart folks who swore that they would be done with this this annoying idea. And here we are 30 years later. None of the systems that I talked about in Darwin's black box have been explained. Few of them have even been tried because nobody has an idea how to approach it. And if smart scientists in their labs can't even think of a way to approach it, how is stupid nature, how just by randomly breaking stuff, how's that supposed to work? So
So
yeah,
Gabe,
no.
Gabe, you want to follow up on that, Gabe, if you would. Now, for the sake of the students that are here, hearing 70,000 mutations, is there any validation to microevolution versus macroevolution as they are students on the campus hearing these mutations validating microevolution or macroevolution? Can you address that for these students?
Yeah, sure. Sure. There's lots of good evidence showing that microevolution is correct. If you're careful, you always have to define your terms in this game. Otherwise, you get hopelessly confused. One great micro mutation, micro adaptation that everybody's heard of is sickle cell hemoglobin, which can cause sickle cell disease. If turns out if one of your parents has this a mutation in hemoglobin, where 1 out of 150 or so amino acid residues in one chain of hemoglobin has been altered, just 1 out of 150. If you get that mutation from one parent and a normal hemoglobin from the other parent, that gives a little bit of protection against malaria, which is, excuse me, which is a scourge in tropical regions of the planet. Heck, that's great. Of course, if you get two copies of it, then you have sickle cell disease, and that's a horrible disease and fatal if you don't have modern medical care. So we have lots of different machinery in us, and mutations do happen. Every now and again, it helps to change something. In the example of hemoglobin, if you could change that, it gave it a little bit of protection against malaria. I don't have time to go into the mechanism, but it's a trivial mechanism. Most frequently, you see micro mutations, micro evolution in things like dog breeds. A lot of evolutionists have pointed to dog breeds in the past and say, look at all of the different sizes and shapes and colors and stuff of dogs that have been bred in just the past couple hundred years. And that shows the power of selection and evolution. Well, it turns out that, as I said, scientists have developed marvelous methods to now get the sequence of DNA pretty easily from large numbers of organisms. So some scientists, simply because they wanted to see how evolution works and adaptation works, have sequenced the entire genomes of different breeds of dogs, dachshunds and French poodles and bulldogs and all sorts of things. And I discussed this in my latest book called Darwin Devolves, not evolves, devolves. And the interesting thing is that in almost all cases, the characteristic mutations that define a breed are ones in which particular genes are broken, not made, not new things made, they're broken. If you think about it, if you want a dog that has short legs, you can break a gene that's involved in making legs normal size. If you want a dog that doesn't have a long snout but a short snout like a bulldog, you can break a gene that's involved in facial development. If you want a dog with curly hair, you can break a gene involved in making the correct shape hair. It turns out that as I said, it's easy to break genes. And sometimes that changes the development of an organism in a way that you think is pleasing to your eye in the case of dogs, or sometimes helps an organism actually survive in the wild. Another case I talk about in Darwin Devolves is the polar bear, which is thought to be descended from the grizzly bear or brown bear. And again, some scientists were interested just because they wanted to see how evolution made this polar bear, starting from a grizzly bear. And so they sequenced the entire DNA of grizzly bears and polar bears, looked at the top 20 or so mutations. The most prominent, the most highly selected mutation was one which broke a gene involved in putting pigment, brown pigment, into the fur of the polar bear, so that now its fur was colorless or white, as opposed to the grizzly. Well, that helps it. It helps it survive, but it was achieved by breaking something that was already there. The second most highly selected gene was one involved in digestion. And it turns out polar bears eat a lot of blubber from seals. And so they get a lot of cholesterol from eating all this fat. Grizzly bears eat berries and bunny rabbits and things. So as we know, if we eat a lot of cholesterol, we got big problems. But grizzly bears don't seem to have these problems. Turns out that there's a gene to make a machine that helps take cholesterol from the digestive tract and transport it into the bloodstream. And in grizzly bears, that's broken. So the cholesterol doesn't get into the bloodstream, and that protects it from the bad effects of too much cholesterol. So again,
just to clarify there, I think you meant polar bears. The gene was broken,
yes,
so that
yes.
yes.
Okay, sorry.
Just
yes,
one more point, because I don't know if Ken saw this follow-up question, but would multiple microevolutionary mutations result in a new species of microevolution? And what you're saying here, as I understand it, is that it is the breaking of a gene and not the creating of a new gene that militates against the idea that multiple microevolutionary adaptations could result in a new species of macroevolution. Am I correct on that?
That is correct. Yes, that's the general idea. And you can think that's very friendly to design, because if you were a designer, something cool that you could do is make a basal species or in the first species, and realize that it could fill various niches when it goes out into the world by random changes which break this over here and break that over there. And, because it does not have this gene working over here, it adapts better to a particular circumstance here and better over here. It's interesting. In one of the chapters in Darwin Devolves, I talk about species that have, or about groups of organisms that have developed a lot of species. Darwin saw the finches in the Galapagos, and there are a number of instances where some group of organisms have given rise to a lot of species. In Africa, there are fish called cichlid fish. And in Hawaii, there are groups of insects called different flies called Drosophila. And it turns out that in these spaces, they have developed, 1,000 new species. But it turns out that they develop you may remember the biological classification is species is the lowest level of difference in biology. The next highest level is genus. So things in the same genus resemble each other, but not as closely as species. The next highest is family, and then go up to order and other levels too. In these greatly proliferating groups of organisms, you get 1,000 new species. You might get 20 new genera, and you get 0 new families. So all of the cichlids are cichlids, and there's cichlids in other places in the world. All of the Drosophila in Hawaii are Drosophila, and they don't change above that level. So I speculated, or I offered an informed opinion in Darwin Devolves that that random changes and selection can do some things, and they might change things at the species level or at the genus level, but to get beyond the family level, you need purposeful design. You need features that change things in coordination such that that was the kind of dividing line between randomness, which does happen in our world, and design, which is required to explain life.
Thank you, Dr. Behe. That was excellent. We've got a couple more questions. How are you holding up? You doing okay?
Yeah, I'm doing great.
Okay, we're going to take Pastor Dave Polis has got a great question. So Dave Polis, if you're on, go ahead and pose your question to Michael.
Hey, I'm a big fan, Dr. Michael, so appreciate you being with us today. Read your book on Darwin's Black Box right when it came out and loved it. Yeah, I work with students, and I'm always wanting to listen to them. And a lot of them, obviously, they've been fed this bill of lies for years about evolution, and they haven't thought critically about it. And I hate to sound mean, but what I like to do is elevate their argument to the best it can possibly be, and then destroy it and deconstruct it. Mm-hmm. So, what has been for you the most credible or scientific pushback or criticism of irreducible complexity that you've come across maybe on the college campus, so that way I can prepare and be able to deconstruct it?
Well, let's see. The one I think that's most often used is to say, well, you talked about this molecular machine here. Here's one that sort of kind of looks like it. Well, see, therefore it's not irreducibly complex, without either explaining, the other one, this one, or how one could turn into the other. In particular, the bacterial flagellum and something called the type 3 secretory system. For those who haven't heard of it, the flagellum is this rotary motor that bacteria use to swim. There is also something called the type 3 secretory system, which has some parts in common, roughly, with the flagellum, but in fact, it's just the flagellum has a bunch of different parts to it, and the flagellum has to construct itself. There's no workman in the cell. So one way it does so is that when it forms, it makes a hollow tube in the cell membrane, and it pumps up proteins that are components of the structure outside the cell. And that's very highly controlled. And that wasn't even known when Darwin's Black Box was first published. It turns out then that there's also a machine called the type 3 secretory system, which has some components in common, but others not in common with a flagellum. And that also pumps proteins up. And It is oftentimes used as a weapon for bacteria that are preying on other bacteria to pump poisonous proteins into the other bacteria's cell membrane and kill them and then eat them. Okay. So people say, ha, look at this. This has some components in common. Well, number one, the type 3 secretory system isn't a flagellum. It can't rotate a propeller. It doesn't drive anything forward. So it doesn't explain the flagellum. Nobody has explained even how this supposedly simpler type 3 secretory system might have been built up step by step in a Darwinian process. All they have done is say that, well, this kind of resembles that and that kind of resembles that. So maybe the flagellum came from that. So I try to point that out, but also
argument would
I'm
be
sorry?
the one that is used. The resemblance argument, at a cellular level might be a typical criticism or at least pushback to irreducible complexity.
Well, in the case of the flagellum, though, the interesting thing that has developed since in the past 10 years or so is that microbiologists have concluded that the flagellum came first and the type 3 secretory system came after it. So they're speculating that maybe it devolved into the simpler type 3 secretory system. And that's an interesting idea, but it's certainly not a Darwinian explanation for much of anything to say that I've got this unexplained complex machine and you can take away some parts and use the residuals for something else. So that in that particular instance, that impresses a lot of people. But in general, yeah, you're competing against just so stories, and the just so stories are simple and they're just designed to appeal. And the problem that we have is that we want to point out the problems with all of these, and a lot of people don't have the patience or the time or the capacity to follow those arguments along. So I myself personally have become much more excited about the devolution argument because that's easy to understand. When you tell people that, why, look, all these dog breeds are devolving, they're not evolving. And you can say, well, things might change in nature, but they're probably either, number one, devolving, like in the case of the cichlid fish and the Drosophila and so on, or they're being guided or designed in nature. And that might help people who don't follow this full time or have other things going on in their life to more easily grasp the problems.
Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
I think Michael, we got another good question. We're gonna try and grab people who haven't had a chance.
Okay.
Bob Clapper has a good question. Bob, are you still with us?
Yes.
Go ahead and pose your question, please.
He may not be able to do it verbally, but he says, can you comment
Okay,
on
I'm
one
here
of the
right
best
now.
evidences for...
Go ahead, Bob.
Okay, good.
One of the best evidences for evolution is ERVs. They call them genetic scars sometimes being passed on. And I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Okay. I'd say ERVs are endogenous retroviruses, and they are sequences in genomes that look like sequences of viruses that we know about. And one thing I make a distinction between is design and general evolution. Evolution in the sense of just things being descended from other things, I don't make a point of arguing against, because I want to keep the focus on the question of how can things be designed, how can sophisticated machinery appear. At its best, some people say, hey, look, these unusual sequences appear in this organism over here, maybe apes. And why, look over here, they appear in humans too, or, in other types of organisms. And folks who talk about that simply want to talk about common descent. That is, we think that these organisms came from that. And, you can be skeptical of common descent, but it's my experience that it's a whole lot easier to hold evolutionists' feet to the fire when you're asking them to explain how complex structures got there, rather than whether for some reason we have this in common with a different kind of a different organism. The assumption behind these ERVs is that they don't do anything. As the question says, they're just genetic scars. And why would a designer put a virus over here and then replicate it over here? Or it clearly looks like common descent. Well, there's a lot of assumptions going on in there. And the more that science progresses, the more we find things that we didn't know how to function do have functions. There are sequences in DNA that people thought called junk because they were short and they were repeated many, many times. And they said, well, what is this? This can't have a function. It's junk. And what designer worth his salt would put so much junk in there? Well, again, I say, well, leave that aside. Look at this complex thing over here. And as time goes on, people say, well, look, if you look at this disease in humans, here's this terrible, nervous system disease. And people have methods to track down where mutations occur in the genome that cause certain diseases. And they say, why, look, a mutation in the junk region of DNA, if this mutation occurs, somebody gets this bad disease. So clearly it's doing something. It's just that we don't yet have the tools or the concepts to understand how all of this is working. So, so I would say, well, ERGs aren't well understood, that 10, 20 years ago, scientists were calling vast swaths of the human genome junk, and they now have taken that back. Even, straight Darwinists will now say, no, we were mistaken. This has function. So let's not talk about something whose function, we don't know about. Let's talk about these things over here, which do these fantastic, do have these fantastic abilities. And let's ask how those came to be. So I would, in a situation like that, I would say, we don't know everything about biology. So let's talk about the things we know best. And again, and then you can also throw in talks about devolution and the very great propensity of Darwinian processes to break things, and on occasion breaking things helps an organism survive, and that's the dominant mode of Darwinian evolution. Does that sound reasonable? I guess not.
Yes, it does.
I like
I
it.
think that was great,
Yes, it
Michael.
does. Thank you
Okay,
for the
great.
response.
Okay,
Yeah.
sure. Great.
Okay, well, Michael, let's do this on a count of time. You've been very gracious and generous with your time, and we appreciate that. We're going to take one more, if that's okay with you, Dr. Leo. Someone who maybe hasn't had a chance. If you've got a burning question or a discussion point, go ahead and pop on and ask Dr. Behe, and we'll conclude with this last question.
Just two thoughts there is that we do have a professor, Professor Peggy of microbiology. She may have something particular. I think we have one of the guys on the God's Not Dead team, Igor, that's also got a question up there. So,
Okay,
so
go ahead. Go ahead. Either one of those. Go ahead and pose that question if you're on.
Igor, is that you? Or Peggy? Either one. Or anyone else? Or Gabe, you had a follow-up question, so feel free.
I think you've maybe spoken to this, but this, I feel like I get the impression I get from people is they kind of think of DNA as messy, and you'll hear things like these organisms that seem like they're far simpler than human beings, but their DNA is way bigger. And again, I'm speaking not from specific knowledge here, but and so this kind of messiness of the DNA and the banana's DNA or something is, 10 times as large as human DNA just kind of gives this general impression to people, maybe without the specifics, that how could this be designed? If maybe you've already spoken to that in detail enough, if there's anything else you want to add to that, great.
Well, no, I think that's kind of just comes under the same category as the last question. There's something we don't understand, and so we can't conclude from it much of anything. At least that's what I reply. It might be some organisms have a lot more DNA because they want to expand the size of their cell, and that helps them expand it, or they would benefit from having a larger nucleus, which might give us enough osmotic pressure to keep the organism, to give its structure the right properties. It might be for something other than just conveying genetic information. Nobody says all of DNA has to be coding information. Some might be structural. Some might have other functions. So again, the history of arguments in biology that some structure is stupid and doesn't have a function is very poor. The more people know, the more functions they find. Things that they thought were dumb before turn out to be really elegant solutions to a problem nobody had never realized existed. I know.
So it's almost like the two things go in reverse, like you were saying, like Darwinism actually breaks stuff, doesn't build stuff.
Exactly.
And stuff we think doesn't work actually does work. It's the reverse in both cases.
That's right. Yeah. I think just countering, I'm not sure how I would answer, some, 20-year-old who came up with that question, other than to say there's lots of mysteries in life. Some things that we didn't know have a function for, now we do. And let's focus on things that are well worked out and see if, do they fit into the Darwinian scheme. So I'd try to redirect it that way.
Thank you.
Okay.
Excellent. Dr. Leo, do you have anything else? Or, I think that's.
I would like to ask Dr. Behe if you would look in the chat. I tried to summarize what I thought you said. I don't want to mislead Christopher or any of the students that are on here or anyone else, but my understanding would be this: multiple microevolution mutations cannot lead to macroevolution produce new families, because microevolution mutations result in the breaking of genes and not the creation of new genes resulting in microevolution of a new family. Would that be a correct statement?
That's pretty close. If I were writing it for a journal, I'd make some distinctions and stuff, but that's pretty close. That's correct. You can't add up little things to get a very large change. There was a guy I know named David Berlinski who's written on evolution before, and he made the point that the Israeli Air Force had a particular kind of jet, and they made 300 changes to that jet, and it was still the same kind of jet, but with a couple of new systems in it. And so yeah, small changes in complex systems generally do not add up to new things.
And the last thing I'd ask is, it appears that Darwin's evolutionary theory is based upon undisciplined imagination, as you said. And what we have here is Dr. Behe's theory of devolution, which is based upon science of the breaking of genes, resulting in microevolution only.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. And that's a really surprising development. Let me emphasize that. And it's only been 20 years since we've had the tools to be able to see, in particular, what changes in DNA, because evolution is driven by changes in molecules. And it was only 20 years that we've been able to track these guys down. And the surprising thing, but in retrospect, we should have expected it, is that it's a lot easier to break stuff than to make stuff. And many times in complex systems, throwing something out might help it adapt to some particular kind of niche. And that's apparently what we see in almost all the famous examples of evolution, like dog breeds and polar bears and things like that.
Seems like it conforms to the second law of thermodynamics,
Yeah,
that things devolve. Yeah. So
exactly.
Ken, I know that you travel with Dr. Behe, and I prayed for him this morning for his health. Sounds like he's doing pretty good. Would you like to pray for Dr. Behe's travels and close out?
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Michael. This has been great, and I think you've helped a lot of people. And I just want to say at the end, let's follow the evidence where it leads. And I think that was Anthony Fleur's advice, the philosopher who finally said, look, there is a God because of the evidence pointing there. And I think you've given us great evidence, very compelling evidence to continue that point. So, Lord, we thank you for Michael B., his family. Bless him, bless his work, bless his writings. Lord, thank you for just the blessing he's been and just the instrument he's been in your hands. We pray a blessing on all the participants and people who logged on. Lord, let them be effective. Let them be good apologists and defend the truth of who you are and that you are our creator. And we give you praise and glory in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all, guys, for joining us. And we really appreciate it.
Ken, we're going to have to get you back on here sometime.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
God bless you.
Thank
Bless
you.
you.
Bye-bye.